During the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a push across China to construct air raid shelters in major cities vulnerable to aerial attacks. Shanghai notably had been the target of multiple air raids throughout the previous decades. However, by the beginning of the 1980s, with international tensions easing and China developing economically, the decision was made to use the shelters commercially. In the Shanghai district of Jing'an, one such shelter was converted into the basement rooms of the Jianhua guest house. Room 42 was a converted air raid shelter, and on the morning of August 10, 1981, one of the cleaning staff entered the room. Walking into the three-bed dormitory, she noticed one of the guests, apparently still sleeping. The cleaner announced she was going to tidy the room, but getting no response, she got on with the task as quietly as possible, trying not to wake the sleeping guest. The following day, the cleaner saw the same man in bed again, in the exact same position she'd seen him the previous morning. Thinking it unusual and slightly concerned, the cleaner called out a few times in efforts to get the apparently sleeping guest to stir, but once again got no response. She went to take a closer look at the guest. Prodding the man, she immediately noticed his body felt stiff. Pulling back the quilt, she saw the man's face was pale, and blood from his mouth had dried on his face and the mattress. The only visible injuries were noticeable scorch marks on the lifeless man's temples. The victim was named as Li Jiahui, from the Shandong province city Qingdao, around 750 kilometers to the north of Shanghai. The 28-year-old was visiting the city on business in his role as a purchaser for a prosthetics manufacturing company. When officers began their investigation, they learned from speaking with hotel staff that the victim arrived at the guest house with an imported gold watch, and he signed the registration form with an expensive gold pen. Both items were now missing, along with 200 yuan, which according to a company receipt in the man's wallet, he was carrying with him. The 200 yuan, around 24 USD, was a significant amount for the time, the equivalent of several thousand yuan now. When medical examiners looked over the body, other than the burn marks to the victim's head, they found no signs of physical violence. They quickly determined that the cause of death was electrocution. However, despite the victim's possessions being taken, police were unsure if this was a tragic accident or a deliberate act. When examining the room, officers began to believe it was very much intentional. The only power outlets in the room were on the ceiling, and Li Jiahui wasn't carrying any electronic items with him that would have seen him needing to use the plug sockets. While the investigation team gave the room a thorough examination, other officers began speaking with hotel staff and looking over the registration book for guests sharing the room. The three-bed dorm room only had 2 occupants at the time of the incident, one being the deceased Li Jiahui, and another man named Li Yiqing, who checked into the guest house a week prior. Instead of using his identity card, Li Yiqing registered with an employer's invitation letter which claimed he worked for a traditional Chinese medicine hospital in the northeastern Jilin province city Changchun, 1,700 kilometers from Shanghai. Hotel staff seemed to confirm Li Yiqing came from the northeast, saying the guest spoke with a noticeable northeastern accent. Li Yiqing hadn't officially checked out, but staff realized they hadn't seen him for a couple of days. In the room, his belongings were gone, and his bed looked unused. As officers attempted to contact the hospital in Changchun and get more information about the missing Li Yiqing, the investigation team searching the room had made progress into discovering how the victim passed. High up on the ceiling, the room had a ventilation duct, and during the search, officers spotted partial fingerprints in the dust on the covering of the vent. After taking the prints, they then removed the cover to find what they believed was the device used to electrocute Li Jiahui. It was a long plug cord with the plug removed at one end, exposing stripped wires. The stripped wires in the cord were attached to pieces of conductive metal which were slipped inside a woman's hairband, allowing it to easily slide onto someone's head. After placing the band on the target's head, all the suspect had to do was hit the switch on the socket to send electricity surging into the victim. Along with the homemade electrocution device, police also found a fruit knife, which they believed was there for backup if the device didn't quite have enough power to end the victim's life. Information soon came back from Changchun that the traditional Chinese medicine hospital that supposedly provided the invitation letter didn't exist, meaning the letter was a complete forgery. This led police to believe the name Li Yiqing may also be false, but having a physical description and a police sketch of the suspect's face thanks to hotel staff, officers began checking other hotels around the city. The population of Shanghai at the time was a shade under 12 million people, meaning looking for the man using the name Bi Yiqing was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, if he was even still in the city. With the fingerprints taken from the crime scene, officers began comparing them with those of people convicted of crimes they had on file, but going through the 400,000 prints was a long, laborious process. With no computer system to speak of, the prints had to be compared manually by the technicians. There was then further tragedy related to the passing of Li Jiahui. His wife was 8 months pregnant at the time, and on hearing the news of her husband's demise, she required hospitalization and would ultimately lose the child. Police forces in both Shanghai and Changchun did what they could to track down Bi Yiqing, but their efforts failed to bear fruit, and slowly the investigation lost steam. 2 weeks later, on August 26th, in another hotel on the outskirts of the Zhejiang province city Jiaxing, 100 kilometers to the southwest of Shanghai, an almost identical incident occurred. 52-year-old Feng Shouan was working as a purchaser for an agricultural machinery company located in the Zhejiang province city Hangzhou. He checked into the hotel on his way home after completing his business in Shanghai, and was attacked as he slept. Woken when feeling a strange numbing sensation on his head, Feng Shouan saw the figure of someone standing over him in the dark, pressing something against his temples. Feng Shouan began fighting the man off and shouting for help. His attacker attempted to smother him to keep him quiet, but the businessman managed to knock the assailant to the floor. The noise roused a hotel porter who quickly came to the room. Outnumbered, the assailant escaped jumping out the first-floor window. The porter chased the man to the window and saw the attacker leap the hotel's courtyard wall, then wade across the river running past the hotel before disappearing into the night. Feng Shouan was taken to the nearby county hospital after the assault, but was informed he suffered no serious damage. Once again, there were only 2 guests occupying the room at the time. However, when speaking to police, Feng Shouan said he never got a good look at the other person sharing the room with him. Feng Shouan would leave the room early in the morning when going out to work, while the other guest was sleeping, and said the other man returned to the room late at night when he was already in bed. The room was still dark at the time of the assault, meaning Feng Shouan could only give officers a general description of his assailant's physical build. He described the man as being around 1.7 meters tall, of thin build, and around 30 years old. In his rush to escape the scene, the assailant dropped the device he used in the attempt on the life of Feng Shouan, which was a plug cord with exposed wires connected to a headband. Hotel staff said the suspect had been staying in the hotel for a few days and spoke with what they believed was a northeastern accent, adding that he would leave the room mid-morning and return late at night. However, with nothing being taken, and Feng Shouan coming away from the incident unharmed, the small local county police force didn't put too much time into investigating the case. At the time, the investigation team in Shanghai had focused their search across the city and other large cities around the region. Consequently, word about the homicide of Li Jiahui hadn't yet reached the smaller police forces. Ultimately, the attack on Feng Shouan would be put down as an unusual incident and eventually forgotten, without it being connected to the Shanghai case. The Shanghai investigation team was having little luck with tracking down the suspect, but on September 11th, another incident occurred 500 kilometers southwest of Shanghai, in the Jiangxi province city Shangrao. A businessman referred to with the pseudonym Yu Mo was found lying deceased in his bed in a shared guest house room. The victim was found with scorch marks to the head, and the cause of death was later ascribed to electrocution. The Shangrao police, already aware of the incident that took place in Shanghai, contacted their counterparts there and invited them to assist with the investigation. While waiting for the Shanghai team, the Shangrao police got on with investigating the incident themselves. Unlike in the previous case, this time the suspect had taken away the tools of his crime, but police managed to obtain fingerprints from items around the room the suspect touched. The room was being shared by 3 men. Along with the victim, there was a man in his early 20s referred to with the pseudonym Wei Mo, and another man with the name Chen Zhiwei. The 3 men had gone out together the previous evening for a meal and ended up drinking heavily. The younger man Wei Mo somewhat overindulged and passed out on his bed. Once they returned, sleeping through the night while Yu Mo had his life ended. He woke the next morning to find Yu Mo deceased and Chen Zhiwei gone. He described Chen Zhiwei as being thin, around 1.7 meters tall, and speaking with a northeastern accent. The investigation team discovered that several hundred yuan and an expensive watch were taken from the victim. From the unique method used to end the victim's life, the Shanghai team believed the same man was responsible for both crimes, and further evidence collected seemed to confirm their suspicions. The description Wei Mo gave to the police sketch artist was very similar to the image they already had, and when checking the handwriting on the signature for Chen Zhiwei, it appeared to match that of Bi Yiqing. However, with the name Bi Yiqing proven to be a fake identity, police weren't optimistic about Chen Zhiwei being the suspect's real name. Again, the suspect used an invitation letter to register, this time from a travel agency in the northeastern province Heilongjiang, 2,400 kilometers from Shangrao. Predictably, the company which supposedly provided the letter was found to be non-existent, meaning the name was likely fake again. The fingerprints taken from the Shangrao crime scene later proved to match those taken from the crime scene in Shanghai, removing any doubt that the same man was responsible. However, with little else pointing to the identity of the suspect, and no matches to the fingerprints being found among people already convicted of crimes, the police got no closer to solving the case. On September 25, police in the Jiangxi city Jiujiang, 350 kilometers to the northwest of Shangrao, received an emergency call from the city's workers' hotel about a guest being found deceased in one of the rooms. The victim, identified with the pseudonym Xu Mo, was a purchaser for a clothing company located in Shaoxing City in Zhejiang Province. The incident was almost identical to the two previous homicides. The victim died from being electrocuted, and all money and other valuable items he had were stolen. The Jiujiang investigation team contacted the Shanghai police, informing them of the incident when realizing the obvious connection. Again, the suspect was found to have registered using a company invitation letter, this time stating the man was working for a glassware manufacturing company in Heilongjiang. By now, the suspect was using the name Li Mingchun, with both the letter and name predictably proving to be false. Fingerprints found at the scene and descriptions of the suspect inevitably pointed to the crime being committed by the same person. With 3 homicides now having taken place in a matter of months, and the investigation team having little success with finding the person responsible, the search was expanded to other surrounding provinces. Along with all police forces in Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Jiangxi provinces, information about the suspect was also disseminated to the provinces of Anhui, Fujian, and Guangdong. Since the suspect had been consistently described as speaking with an accent from the northeast, and the fake invitation letters all claimed to be from companies in that region, the provinces of Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning were also alerted. Time passed and no more similar incidents were reported, and despite the various police forces speaking to thousands of possible suspects, all inquiries hit a dead end. Eventually, with no progress being made, less importance was placed on the case. One of the lead investigators, Wang Xuren, kept the case files in his office and continued going over them, trying to find something they missed. But they'd done everything they could with the technology and investigation techniques available at the time. By 1995, the original investigation team all retired from the police, the case remaining unsolved. But in his retirement, Wang Xuren kept copies of the case files to pore over, still hoping the investigation would be closed. Ultimately, it would take another 17 years for his hopes to be realized, and the mystery finally resolved. In 2012, the police in China, like much of the rest of the country, had greatly modernized. Fingerprint records from people convicted of crimes were now on computer databases, making it much easier to close unsolved cases. Every 6 months, police forces in China look over old cold case files in efforts to close the investigations. On April 17, 2012, Shanghai police officer Liu Zhixiong was going through fingerprint records of cold cases, among them the 3 robberies where the victims were electrocuted, and came up with a possible match. The matching prints belonged to an individual named Ai Hong Guang, who'd been jailed after being convicted of robbery in the Jiangxi city Yingtan, 600 kilometers to the southwest of Shanghai, in 1983. Now in his 60s, Ai Hong Guang fell into the right age range for the suspect. Furthermore, he was around 1.7 meters tall and of thin build, matching the descriptions given over 30 years ago. However, he was native to Jiangxi province, not the northeast, as the accent the suspect spoke with, according to witnesses, suggested. With 31 years passing since the last homicide, technicians double-checked the prints manually to confirm they were a match. They also contacted the now 77-year-old Wang Xueren to ask about his recollections of the case. Despite being long retired, he still had copies of the original case files, and continued to look through them over the years, still hoping he'd spot something that would lead to the case being solved. Stunned that there was finally a possible suspect, he asked if he could watch the interrogation once the arrest was made, and his request would be granted. Once the matching of the fingerprints was confirmed to be accurate, police went out to arrest Ai Hong Guang. Ai Hong Guang was registered as still living in Bailu Town, part of Yingtan City, in Jiangxi province. When officers got to his home address, they were told Ai Hong Guang was working as an electrician on a Nanchang City construction site, 150 kilometers to the west. On April 21, 2012, an investigation team from Shanghai arrived at the site, and were pointed in the direction of the man they were looking for. They immediately noticed the resemblance between Ai Hong Guang and the man depicted in the police sketch produced 31 years prior. Speaking to the suspect, an officer asked if his name was Ai Hong Guang or Li Yiqing, to gauge the man's reaction. Ai Hong Guang looked flustered for a moment but quickly regained his composure and said he'd never heard the name Li Yiqing. The officers informed him about evidence coming to light connecting him with an old investigation, and they were going to take him to Shanghai for questioning. Without knowing what he was being accused of, Ai Hong Guang immediately began protesting his innocence. However, when the arresting officers attempted to take his fingerprints, he resisted in efforts to stop them. Once in Shanghai, and facing interrogation after hearing the charges against him, Ai Hong Guang pled innocence and refused to admit being the person responsible.
我记不起来了。你记得？不要讲故事啊。不会。我就做过1000年对不起人家，也对不起政府的事。
When asked where he was on the dates the crimes were committed, he responded by saying it was so long ago he couldn't remember, claimed he'd never been to Shanghai, and argued he wasn't capable of taking someone's life. However, as police showed him the evidence they had, he finally admitted to something, claiming the only thing he needed to apologize for was the attempted robbery in Jiaxing.
是那个拿那个灯头在里设我们这个房间，再骗了他一下。我当时想就是骗他一下，拿几百钱。我一碰到他，他就叫了，我就跑。
This was the assault on Feng Shouan, which wasn't in the case file, and was the first time the new investigation team and Wang Xueren had heard of it. Looking through old case files from Zhejiang province now uploaded to the computer system, the team found the original police report, and also discovered that Feng Shouan was still alive and living in Hangzhou. Officers were sent to speak with Feng Shouan, hoping he'd identify Ai Hong Guang as the person who attacked him. Now 83 years old, Feng Shouan was in remarkably good health for his age, and recalled the incident as if it happened yesterday. While he couldn't identify Ai Hong Guang for certain, never really getting a good look at his face, he offered circumstantial information which potentially pointed to Ai Hong Guang being the person responsible. He remembered that as he and the porter watched his assailant escape, the man entered the river running alongside the hotel, and waded across to the other side. While the water only went up to the assailant's chest, wading across the river was much slower than swimming, leading Feng Shouan to believe the man couldn't swim. When officers returned to interrogating Ai Hong Guang, he was thrown off by them asking if he could swim. Puzzled by the question, Ai Hong Guang admitted he couldn't. The interrogating officers then cleared up his confusion, telling him they'd spoken to the victim of the attempted robbery, to which he'd confessed. Ai Hong Guang only confessed to the incident because he believed that after so many years, it was likely that Feng Shouan had passed away. Hearing Feng Shouan was alive and well, he wrongly believed the man had positively identified him. On May 15, Ai Hong Guang finally confessed to the 4 crimes, and told the interrogating officers what led him to end the lives of 3 people. Born 1949 in the Jiangxi province city Yingtan, after leaving school Ai Hong Guang decided to join the military, which saw him being stationed in the northeast of the country, where he picked up the local accent. Along with the northeastern accent, his service also saw him gain skills as an electrician while he served in the mechanic corps. After being demobilized and returning to Yingtan, his military service helped him get work in an agricultural machinery factory, where he largely worked on repairing tractors. He would marry and go on to have 3 children. However, while the salary he received was enough to cover the family's living expenses, it left little extra. While he worked long hours for little financial reward, many of his friends were what in China are referred to as 狐朋狗友, a Chinese idiom meaning fox and dog friends. The term refers to people who seem to be able to go out drinking, eating in restaurants and enjoying the nightlife, while never being worried about having to work. Envious of his friend's apparent freedom, Ai Hong Guang thought about ways to get rich quick. Then seeing a man fishing one day, he came up with an idea. The fisherman was using the now illegal technique of electric fishing, wiring a pole to a portable battery, the electrodes on the end of the pole electrifying the water. Any fish hit by the electric current would either be stunned or die immediately, leaving them easily scooped up into the fisherman's net. With him already being an electrician, Ai Hong Guang hit upon the idea of creating an electrical device that would at the very least incapacitate people, allowing him to rob them. Knowing that traveling businessmen staying in hotels often carried decent amounts of cash, he believed they were the best locations to put his scheme into action. In order to put the police off his scent when the crimes were inevitably discovered, he turned to his fox and dog friends. They knew people who could provide forged documents, including fake invitation letters, allowing him to check into hotels with fake names. Having a convincing northeastern accent, he wanted the letters to state he worked for companies in that region, hoping police would end up looking for him in the wrong place. With Shanghai being relatively nearby and perhaps the wealthiest city in the country, he felt it was the perfect location to look for victims. Arriving in the city and using the name Biyiqing, he checked into the Jianhua guest house and waited for a suitable target to check in to the same room. When Li Jiahui became his roommate, Ai Hong Guang quickly noticed the cash he was carrying, along with the gold watch and pen. He decided to try out the device while Li Jiahui slept, then slid the hairband onto the man's head before plugging it in. It proved to be remarkably effective. Li Jiahui barely showed any reaction as his life was extinguished. After it was done, Ai Hong Guang took the cash, watch, and pen from his victim before panic struck. Ai Hong Guang decided to hide the device in the room's ventilation shaft, leaving behind the partial fingerprints which eventually led to his arrest. Ai Hong Guang then left the hotel without officially checking out. He sold the watch while still in Shanghai, but only received 70 yuan, around $8 for the stolen item, and decided to keep the pin for himself. The robbery homicides of both Yu Mo and Xu Mo went as smoothly as the first, but a combination of factors brought his crime spree to an end. The first was that the crimes weren't making him as much money as he expected, so he began to believe the risks he was taking weren't worth the rewards. The second was that he realized the police investigating the cases were focusing their search for the suspect in the surrounding provinces, and not in the northeast as he'd hoped. Then in 1983 he was involved in an incident that made sure he'd bring his criminal career to an end. The sister of one of his fox and dog friends was herself the victim of a robbery, so in response the brother and Ai Hong Guang tracked the man down, physically assaulted him and stole some money in revenge. The thief subsequently reported both men to the police for the assault and robbery. Ai Hong Guang and the fox and dog friend were quickly arrested and later jailed for the incident. Having a criminal conviction meant his fingerprints were now on file, and Ai Hong Guang believed it was only a matter of time before police connected him to his previous crimes. On being released from jail, Ai Hong Guang decided to keep his nose clean and lead an honest life, all the while fearing the day the police would come knocking on his door. He largely took work on construction sites where he could be paid in cash, thus keeping his name off official records as much as possible. Despite his efforts to remain low profile, his fears that his past would catch up with him eventually came true, albeit 31 years later. After confessing and being charged with 3 counts of intentional homicide, there remained a question mark over what the next step would be. In Chinese law, the statute of limitations for criminal acts is 20 years, meaning there was a possibility Ai Hong Guang would escape being punished for the crimes. However, the statute is often waived for major cases, and given the serious nature of his offenses, the courts decided Ai Hong Guang needed to stand trial where he faced the realistic possibility of receiving the death sentence. On November 1, 2013, Ai Hong Guang appeared in court to hear his fate. He was handed the death penalty for 3 counts of intentional homicide and 4 counts of robbery. However, partly due to his age, the punishment came with a 2-year suspension. Ultimately, the sentence was reduced to life in prison, which often sees offenders released after serving 10 years. Since the announcement of his sentence being commuted to life in prison, there has been no more information made publicly available about the eventual fate of Ai Hong Guang. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.